So, welcome again to another edition of Your Questions Answered. I'm joined here by a friend of mine, Alan Mansfield, who happens to also work in this building for the AMWU as a workers' comp. What's your title exactly?
He's Workers' Comp and Rehabilitation Officer.
There you go. So he's joining me as a friend, a long-time unionist, a long-time union industrial organiser as well, to answer a question that keeps on cropping up, but it's not actually a workers' comp question, although people do tend to think about it, and that is medical retirement. So I do know a lot about medical retirement from my days as a union organiser, but that's been a couple of years ago now. So Alan's here to fill in the details where I may or may not get it wrong. So Alan, first and foremost, medical retirement is not workers' compensation, is it?
It's an employment issue. It might arise from workers' compensation, but it's an employment and industrial relations matter.
Okay. Now, there are two things that can happen for medical retirement to start it off. One is the employer approaching the employee.
True.
The other is the employee approaching the employer.
Which is probably rarer, or for whatever reason we rarely hear of members approaching the employer.
I had a few of those in my time with the PSA.
Yeah.
But then when the employer approaches the employee, there's got to be a reason. They can't just pull somebody off shift, can they?
That's correct. They've got to substantiate it. There's got to be legitimate reasons, substantial periods of time off work, substantial incapacity to not do their inherent requirements of their job. There's got to be sound reasons for it.
Yeah, so they can't pull somebody off the job. There has to be reasons for it. It could be a physical or psychological injury. You can usually tell because you've been sick for quite some time, which is where the workers' comp comes into it. So if you've been sick for quite some time and it's injury while at work, you're likely to be on workers' comp, but it isn't workers' comp related, and that's where people get confused.
That's hard. Yeah.
The other thing is that they do need a reason for it. The second question, which I call part 5 of this question, or point 5 of the question, the actual question, is the capacity for an employer to send a worker to a doctor. Now again, they need substantial reasons to do that, but they have that authority, don't they?
It's got to be reasonable and lawful, and to use the foundation of union membership is we would help a member with, in the first place, saying to the employer, for instance, what are the grounds, what are the reasons that you think that you've got a reasonable and lawful reasons to send someone, and in the first instance we would be saying, well, why is that information not available from a workers' doctor? And if someone said to us that I've provided this information, we would challenge it at that time to say, well, you've got this information.
Yeah. So some of the times that we might be sent, an employer might try to use their power to send you to a worker to their own doctor, the employer's doctor, is when you've had time off and you're coming back to work. Mm-hmm. So the return to work plan, they like using the work health and safety legislation to say, well, we need to do this to create a return to work plan for you. That's not necessarily the case, and they don't necessarily have a legal reason for doing that.
And it's worth, in the context of what the Injured Workers Support Network is, it's worth considering this. If it is wholly and solely been a workers' comp process, and you have worked through the workers' comp process, and you're fit to return to work without limitations, or you're returning to work with some restrictions, but you've gone through the injury management process, then I would say that the employer has no additional rights to then go off on some adventure of obtaining information outside of the workers' comp scheme. They will argue differently.
Well, they might argue differently, but we don't normally get those cases coming through. So the questions come from people who have not been on the workers' comp.
They're being sick of some sort.
Sick outside of work.
Yeah.
And so, they do need to make sure that you're capable of returning to work. In some industries, that's really important, like in construction. If you're a firey or going to the front lines again in those types of jobs, that is important.
Yeah.
It's less important if you're a clerical officer or you're a warehouse, and it does get abused by the employer. But at the same time, if your doctor says that you're capable of returning to work and there are no questions about your capability of returning to work, that should satisfy an employer.
Yeah.
So a lot of employers actually don't know how to go through the process, more so than employers trying to abuse that process, although we do know of employers who do abuse
That's
that
right.
process.
And maybe a way to deal with this in good foundation is that a worker's obligation is to provide a medical certificate when they're returning from sickness. Sadly, we see some employers where there's been other things going on clearly, but the worker might have had a day or two off and someone is saying, you have to go to the company doctor.
Yeah.
You know, and you could argue that that's the beginning of, and can be the beginning, sadly, of some medical retirement attempts. If you're provided a medical certificate and said you're fit, you've met your legal obligations. But it's worth dealing with it in that really short periods of time. If you're provided medical certificates and provided valid information, that doesn't uncrack, that doesn't commence the medical retirement process at all.
Yeah. If you're concerned about this, if you don't know the reasons why you're being sent to a doctor by your employer, probably they're not doing it for legitimate reasons. The vast majority of people will have a definite, this is the reason why I'm being sent to the doctor, this is what's happening in my life, these are the issues that I'm facing, health issues that I'm facing. Now, with medical retirement, it's not industrial, it is industrial, sorry, it's not workers' compensation. In the public service, I know that it takes quite some time to medically retire someone. So the average for us was between 6 to 1 year before medical retirement happened.
Yeah.
I'm not too certain about the private sector in that.
Okay, it can vary.
Yeah.
It can be variable, and it can be variable because there's virtually nil policy, and they're virtually relying on common law and external, you know, for want of a better way of saying it, external legal advice.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the companies have actually developed a medical retirement policy, and they will work their way through.
And that's a good segue to the next point, which is if you're looking at medical retirement, even if you're wanting medical retirements or your company's suggesting you're going to get medically retired or they would like you to get medically retired, where you find the legislation and the laws around it are mostly in the awards and the enterprise agreements.
That's right.
There's some information in the Fair Work Act.
Yeah.
There's some information in the Industrial Relations Act of New South Wales if you're there. But the vast majority is just in your awards and your enterprise agreements.
And I guess, it is worthwhile actually touching upon it this time. If you're a New South Wales workers' compensation injured worker, you have in effect a protection from medical retirement in that an employer can't terminate you with any earlier than 6 months after the first day of disability. If they do terminate you, you've got an entitlement to reapply for that job within 2 years of that termination for your pre-injury job or similar job. There is law around it, and people should seek advice around it.
And in saying that, because we're talking about medical retirement, which is
broader,
workers' comp, the standard time where you're protected if you're sick is 3 months.
Yeah.
So, and you still have that 2 years after that to reapply.
But remembering it's 3 months off in 12 months, and that you need to seek advice. And it's problematic. It's problematic once you've hit 3 months of unpaid leave is the real trigger point.
Okay. The other thing about medical retirement that we get a lot of is, are there any greater benefits to medical retirement than there are to resigning or normal retirement? Now, this very much depends on your award or your enterprise agreement. Some enterprise agreements have what I would call it a payout figure for medical retirements. If you're in the public service, some of the awards, I believe the Police Award and maybe the Fireys Award that I'm aware of, but I'm not too sure, might have a payout figure for medical retirements. If you're a normal public service servant, say you're working for the Department of Treasury and you're under that, there's no benefit to medical retirement.
That's right. It's a termination. They might have worked through a policy of medical retirement, but it's a termination because you can't do the inherent requirements of your job.
Yeah.
That's the sad reality.
So the take-home message.
Can I say? Sure. I guess two things is, again, it's worth saying people should seek advice because in conjunction with whatever insurance policies they might have that they hold privately, or their superannuation policies, it is probably worthwhile understanding the effect or the opportunities that might arise in that. And the other side of that, and it's probably something for another broadcast, is that employers have some obligations to make reasonable adjustments at the workplace before moving to termination, and you should explore your rights. You should make sure that if it is a simple physical adjustment or some flexibility change to hours, there may be absolutely no reason to consider medical retirement.
Yeah, very good points to make. Seek advice. It's not an automatic thing. It doesn't necessarily provide you with any more benefits than what you'd normally get if you retired or resigned. It is a form of termination.
That's right.
Therefore, you need help. You should always have it. If you're not in a union yet, join a union. If you've got friends who aren't in unions, make sure they join the unions. To be quite honest, you've got that right to join or not to join. But if you're dealing with medical retirement or thinking about that might be a possibility, the unions are the only independent advice you're going to get unless you pay for it through a lawyer, and they can access lawyers. Yeah. So, apart from that plug for the AMWU, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
And I'll see you later.
See you later.